It is a great week to be a Bethesda fan. Earlier today, we got an interview between Todd Howard and IGN, and this is a super interesting one. There's definitely a lot to infer from this, or some quotes you can dig into, but also just some concrete details on Starfield, some high-level stuff on the Elder Scrolls 6, and what was to me one of the most interesting pieces, they actually talk about the future of the Fallout franchise, and we get an update as to where Fallout 5 stands right now. And I'm pretty sure that is literally the first time Bethesda has ever really mentioned anything on a Fallout 5 concretely. And then even just some stuff on Skyrim itself and the Indiana Jones game that Todd Howard is executive producing. So that of course is today, but even just tomorrow, Todd Howard's doing an AMA on Reddit, which is another big thing to look forward to. We could potentially get another wave of new information and details on all of these games. But either way, looking first at this IGN interview, it was actually a really good one of my favorite Todd Howard interviews overall. I listened to the whole interview, and one of the things I wanted to do is actually break it up into sections. So first, we're going to look at Starfield. A point that is quite heavily emphasized in the video is it really seems like the Starfield release date is largely set in stone. The interviewer kind of made the joke that even though we did technically get the release date with the teaser trailer, in current times with game development, release dates aren't really written in ink, but Todd Howard refutes that, basically saying this was written in ink, and consistently kind of makes it seem that no, that is probably going to be the release date.
No game release dates get written in ink anymore until like they've...
Yeah, we wrote it pretty hard in that trailer. So.
Well, I want to ask you about that in a minute, but...
That felt like some ink.
Definitely seems like there's quite a bit of confidence from Bethesda that is in fact when we'll all be able to play Starfield. And even further, they mention how Starfield is currently in a state where you can actually play the whole thing.
We're at a state where you can play the whole game,
yeah.
But again, there's so much to do. It's a very, very ambitious game.
So likely all of the major story notes, or at least the core main quest, was implemented, or at least that's kind of what I interpreted from that quote, although it's not fully complete in the sense that they're just bug fixing. There's still other stuff they're adding into the game, but overall it seems like things are progressing steadily. On the topic of working on new games, they describe how at Bethesda, they typically develop things in a order of concept art, then the UI, and then the music for that game. And that was the order things were done for Starfield. The music was actually created pretty early on with this title. This being because it actually gives you a more complete feeling of the tone of the game. Although we also do hear about the tech gap that is coming with Starfield. Of course, we've had quotes and a ton of discussion and speculation around this in the past, but Todd Howard actually clarifies on that a bit further here, saying how he thinks the tech jump with Starfield coming from Fallout 4/Fallout 76 will be the biggest ever for the company, bigger than the one for Morrowind to Oblivion. He describes how they redid things like the renderer as well as the underlying guts of the engine itself. We saw the announcement of the Creation Engine 2 and how Starfield will be the first game on that. And I imagine when we first walk into this world and start to interact with it, you'll start to notice a lot about how this has actually been updated. Some things with this are taking longer than they would have liked, but they're also creating data at the same time. And it seems like this is somewhat the process they find themselves at the conclusion of now. They spent a ton of time updating this engine, actually again, redoing the guts of the engine, but at the same time, they were creating data. They were making art, making assets for the game. So then there was a whole process of actually intertwining those two things, implementing that data into this now updated engine. And again, that seems like it is coming to a conclusion around now. A quote that was separate, but keeps coming up, and I think is pretty relevant here, is around what Bethesda got wrong with Skyrim. And one of the answers Todd Howard gives is how parts of Skyrim didn't go deep enough. And then explicitly, he describes this.
It's, okay, whatever that system is, how deep can we make it? The other part is the way the AI and the NPCs really react to you is something that I think we still have a long way to go with.
So describing how the AI and NPCs overall, the world reactivity is just not on the level it could have been, and not on the level it should have been, perhaps. I think the reason this is coming up so often is because that is one of the major technological leaps we'll see with Starfield. I think the AI as a whole, both on an individual level with singular NPCs, and perhaps how entire groups of NPCs or towns, cities, etc. interact, will just be way more advanced with this game. We have heard it now from numerous interviews, and although Todd Howard hasn't really said it explicitly, it definitely feels like it keeps coming up, and that's not just a coincidence. If this is where he thinks things could go further, and he's now creating the game of his dreams with all these advancements, you have to imagine that's something he'd take further. But something else that isn't exactly a concrete confirmation, but is reassuring to hear, is on the modding scene. He describes how one of the big reasons we're still here 10 years later talking about these games is the modding community, and that's definitely not lost on Bethesda. And these two quotes in particular I thought were super interesting.
I think that's fundamental to what we want to do with games where creators can do that. And I think us being active in trying to make it more than a hobby for them, where they can make it their career, I think is really, really good and something that we're going to continue to do.
Modding being fundamental to what they want to do with games, and additional opportunities in the future for modders to actually make this more than a hobby. The fundamental aspect makes me very hopeful that we'll see really good inbuilt mod support with Starfield. Obviously, there's a lot of ways they can go with that. Hopefully console modability returns. That seems to have been a huge success, and hopefully things like greater mod space limits on consoles, or even more modability on consoles and PC. But that secondary part is also pretty interesting. Of course, see Creation Club and how that is giving modders the outlet to actually be able to make money from their hobby, at least for some of them. There's been a lot of talk about how modders don't actually make that. That is completely false. Many of the modders in Creation Club are very, very happy with the amount of money they were making. Bethesda was not skimping on the pay. But this almost makes it sound like Creation Club is continuing, but it isn't, at least not technically. There have been no indications thus far after this 2-year layoff that Creation Club is really making a return. Technically, there'll be stuff on the Creation Club shop with Anniversary Edition, but that almost felt like a separate thing. So maybe we'll see Creation Club return at some point, or maybe it'll just return with Starfield. Todd does reiterate how Starfield is predominantly a single-player game. How the passion behind this game is who you are going to be, the world is for you, and you get to go out and make it your own. But he also does have some pretty interesting comments on social features with Starfield, or really their future games in general.
There are various ways that you can talk about adding social elements to a game that I don't think take away from that.
Yeah.
And we've dabbled with some of that and not put it out, or things on paper, or things that we'd like to try in our games. So I don't want to rule that out. 76 has really ended up being a great experience for us and a great learning one.
I find this interesting because it's one of those things that we heard about 3 years ago, and then I feel like everyone just kind of forgot about. It never really got brought up too heavily again. If you recall, when Starfield was originally announced, the next day we actually saw Todd Howard give that famous YouTube gaming interview, and in that there was asked about, hey, would Starfield potentially have multiplayer? And he said, no, but I don't know, maybe we'll have some kind of social features. Now here we are 3 years later hearing something similar, and it makes me wonder if something like co-op could be possible, or even some kind of lighter multiplayer aspect. Not full-on multiplayer, but some degree of interaction, maybe sharing of assets or something along those lines. Nothing is confirmed with this, but we have this interesting scenario where Bethesda just invested a ton of money and resources into implementing multiplayer support into the engine. That of course was for Fallout 76, but now with the updated engine, could they take advantage of that? Could we get co-op in future Bethesda titles? Not full-on multiplayer modes, but just, hey, want to invite a couple of your friends to play the game with you? I think everyone would pretty much love that. You could just not use it if you don't want to. As far as on the topic of has Skyrim influenced Starfield, they describe how it definitely has that same DNA. In Starfield, you can still touch the world. You can actually see what you're looting from people, the way the factions work. The skill system is apparently similar to Skyrim with some of the stuff from Fallout. That explicitly, Todd Howard does mention how the skill system seems to be fairly similar to the skill system in Skyrim, which is pretty exciting. And leaving off with how Starfield is Skyrim in space in all of the best ways. So definitely a few interesting quotes from that one. Perhaps on some we're reading too deeply into it, but I still think they're interesting conversation pieces. We have about a year until this game comes out, which honestly isn't even that long. But we also do get a few mentions of some high-level stuff when it comes to the Elder Scrolls 6 that I do want to highlight. A great question was on the good or the bad of there being what seems like there'll be a 15-year gap in between Elder Scrolls games. Skyrim in 2011 and the Elder Scrolls 6 in probably 2024 to 2025-ish. And Todd has kind of a mixed answer to this one as far as the good and the bad, where he basically says that, is the franchise still thriving? He looks at Skyrim and says the game is still vibrant. Thankfully, a lot of this due to some of the mods out there. But even further, ESO is huge. It's actually had some of its best years ever as of late. So the Elder Scrolls franchise as a whole is actually still doing pretty good in the meantime. But he also does clarify that they wouldn't plan for this scale of a gap between games. It definitely didn't seem like this was the ideal situation. Todd Howard goes through each of his favorite Elder Scrolls games and describes how each of them has their own identity, and it seems like this will be something they're trying to continue with the Elder Scrolls 6. Skyrim had that really solid gameplay, Oblivion some of the best questing, the discomfort and mystery of Morrowind, the elegance of Arena as well as its flow, and the Elder Scrolls 6 is going to have its own versions of change-ups on the formula.
You know, hopefully Elder Scrolls 6, you don't want to say like, hey, that's worth that kind of weight, but that it does stand up to the series as it has been in a really big, impactful way for when it comes out. You do feel it feels like there's an extra spark, that like we miss it as well, and the things we want to do with it feel very, very fresh.
Which, I mean, yeah, hopefully, because it's going to be about 15 years between games. Hopefully things are at least somewhat fresh. I really love the discussion around Fallout 5, or the Fallout high-level discussion in general, because it kind of got to this point where the interviewer was very clearly trying to ask the question, okay, is somebody else going to make the next Fallout game? Now, with the Microsoft backing, with Bethesda being so busy, it could make a lot of sense for an Obsidian or an InXile to actually take on Fallout. To which Todd does describe that Fallout is very much so a part of the DNA at Bethesda.
I don't see, look, Fallout's really part of our DNA here.
Yeah.
We've worked with other people from time to time. I can't say what's going to happen. You know, we have a one-pager on Fallout 5, what we want to do. But I can't really say today or commit to anything what's going to happen when, other than, hey, our cadence is Starfield and then Elder Scrolls 6.
Right now, they have a one-pager on what Fallout 5 would be, what they want to do with it. But honestly, with all of that, I'm not really entirely sure what to make of it. On paper, it just seems like it makes a lot of sense for Fallout or a Fallout spin-off to be made by someone else at Microsoft, whether it be InXile with the original creators of Fallout or Obsidian, who had so much success with their past iteration. But these quotes definitely make it seem like that's not something Todd's super keen to. But at the same time, maybe that's just what he's saying, so nobody thinks that somebody else is making a Fallout. If he even remotely hinted at Obsidian making a Fallout, that would be the big story here. Although one quote that I found interesting from a different point in this interview, when it came to Starfield, he did mention how if they didn't make it when they did after Fallout 4, then they wouldn't necessarily have a good time to. If not now, then when?
If not now, I'm going back in time. We started in right after Fallout 4, so 2015, end of it. If not now, when? And I felt like the when, if we didn't do it then, the when could be never.
And some of those quotes make me wonder if they're kind of alluding to the idea that Bethesda had this internal schedule of, okay, they're going to have the Fallout spin-off game with Fallout 76, then they're going to have Starfield, then they're going to have the Elder Scrolls 6, and then it's going to be back to Fallout. And that's why if they didn't do Starfield before the Elder Scrolls 6, it wouldn't really be available later on, because perhaps they do want to get to a Fallout after. Either way, that still entails a pretty long gap in between games, but I thought it was worth highlighting. It was definitely interesting to me, at least. On the topic of Skyrim itself, there's a few interesting comments he does have. They describe how Skyrim is still one of Bethesda's top-selling games, which isn't super surprising considering they keep releasing it, but also how Todd Howard in general doesn't actually like minimaps on screen too much. Feels like you start playing the minimap, not the game. He thinks the biggest strengths of Skyrim is the tone of the game is really strong. There's a lot of fantasy games out there, but when you look at Skyrim, you can immediately tell it's Skyrim, not something else. As far as some of his favorite mods, he describes how Sky UI is one of his favorite mods, or technically it says a UI mod, but it's got to be Sky UI, right? Another one he does mention, but again, not by name, is how you can get fast travel markers after buying a house, saying, why didn't we do that? And Todd says he is more of a 30 FPS pretty game person when it comes to BGS games. So if you have the choice at 60 FPS, but lower quality, or 30 FPS and higher quality, he picks 30 FPS. And then lastly, when talking about this Indiana Jones game and how that came to be, it was kind of an interesting story and background on this. Todd Howard is a big Indiana Jones fan. He thinks Raiders of the Lost Ark is one of the best films ever. And he actually pitched this Indiana Jones game to Lucasfilm 10 years ago, and they almost made it. But it was kind of like, okay, which team at Bethesda is going to make this? And it never really ended up coming to fruition. But then more recently, actually pitched the game to Machine Games, then got it approved by Lucasfilms yet again, and now it is all coming together. So it almost seems like this Indiana Jones game was kind of Todd Howard's idea originally, but he's not directly developing it. He's just kind of facilitating its creation in a way. He describes how him being the executive producer means that he'll check in on it periodically. It's not a daily thing for him. It might be once a week or once a month depending on the project's current status. But overall, yeah, that was the Todd Howard interview. He goes over a lot of different things here. I really like this interview. As I said at the start of this one, I like some of the topics that were covered. I liked some of the questions, especially that Fallout future question. I'm happy that was finally brought up, but hopefully we'll find out more tomorrow. Again, there is going to be an AMA. I'm going to be covering whatever is or isn't said there. It might be a short video if there's not much new information. With that said, as always, again, I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope to see you guys all later.